Hello, this is Teresa with another video tutorial for Dare to Be Artsy. Today I'll be showing you how to create this shaker card. I'm using a few products from Dare to Be Artsy, including this coffee cup die and stamp set and the fancy framelits nesting dies. So I'll be using the largest and third largest from the framelit set, and I'll be using the smoke die and cup die too. And I'm showing you this adhesive foam sheet, which I will be using to create the shaker portion of the card. It has a peel back adhesive on one side, so I'm going to use that to construct my shaker. So I'm pulling out the two coffee beans in the set. One is solid and one is an outline. I'm using 3 different ink colors, as you can see from the top, to create my background. So I'll start with one of the colors and then move on to the other 2 colors. And I have my stamp chamois here so that I can clean it off in between colors. If it looks a little splotchy at first, this is a dye ink that actually smooths out as it gets drier. So if you see a little bit of splotchiness, it will clear up after it's completely dried. And what you'll see after I do my initial stamping with the 2 stamps on the block at the same time is I see some areas I need to fill in, and it's not going to be easy to do with both of these stamps on the block. So I'll end up removing one of them and then going back in a few places just to fill it in. And here's the part where I do that. I decide to pull off the outline and fill in with some more of the solid color beans, and I made a little mistake there, stamped over it, but honestly by the time I get finished with this, and you won't even see where I made that mistake, and even the one that's at the edge of the card right now, because that's pretty much going to end up being die cut off later, as you'll see. So not a problem at all. If it had been prominently in the middle, I may have had to start over again. So I was a little more careful as I went on and added the last few beans to fill in the background until I was satisfied with the spacing between them all. And now I'm moving on to create my top frame for the shaker. And I'm using, like I said, the largest and third largest die out of this nesting framelit set. I'm using a piece of brown cardstock that closely matches the colors I've already used to stamp the background. And I'm trimming this down a little bit further to about 5 1/4 by 4 1/4, which is pretty much just large enough for the largest die. And then I'll put the smaller die in the center, and once I have that lined up, I'm going to get some tape, and I did that off screen just to hold it in place until I did the die cut. And here's the die cut. So I have a frame, and I'm pulling out the 2 coffee bean stamps again and lining them up on the block so they're pretty much in a vertical position but not just straight up and down. I'm going to stamp a frame, or a background, so to speak, for my frame by using VersaMark. So what I'm going to do is start in the middle of the side of the frame and then work my way around on both sides. And then I'm just kind of using it as a, I guess, catty corner is about the only way I can describe this. And I decided to go do something a little bit different with the middle to make sure that I didn't have some odd spaces there. And I apparently stamped a little bit too close to the bottom side when I did this right hand side. So now flipping the block over so that I can kind of fit those 2 beans up in that corner, doing the same thing on the opposite side. And to finish the centers at the top and the bottom of the frame, I'm just going to use one of the, actually I'll use both of them. I'll alternate just to keep the pattern going between the solid and outline coffee bean stamp, or at least as close as I can get it to being a full frame. So now that I've done that, I'm going to use clear embossing powder all over where I've stamped all the little coffee beans. And then when it's heat embossed, it'll just look like a dark, slightly raised image. There's no extra color I'm adding to it. So this is a way to ensure that it actually coordinates perfectly with the color of cardstock. And now I'm going to create 2 more frames using the fun foam with the adhesive backing on it. I'm taking the brown die cut that I've already done and using that to help me line up the dies onto the foam. And I had the wrong die at first, so I pulled out the correct one, and now I have the 2 correct ones. And you can kind of feel where the die kind of meets the paper and kind of nests in place on top of it. So that part's not so hard to do. You just kind of have to feel your way around it. Apparently I wasn't using my brain efficiently in deciding where to put the tape so that I could remove the brown paper die cut. Eventually I got it together and taped over both of the dies towards the bottom so I could kind of lift it like a hinge and remove the piece of cardstock. And I will add another piece of tape on the opposite side just to make sure that it stays in place through the die cutting process. I will repeat this one more time on this foam, so that way I can double stack these frames that I've created. And I'm pulling out the first frame. I won't put you through this again since you've already seen it once. I'll just do the second one off camera. So I've also die cut a piece of acetate using the same larger frame die so that it will be the same shape as the brown frame. I'm adding some double-sided adhesive tape before I apply the acetate to the back of this frame to create the top of the shaker card. And I'll move it over here to this side so you can kind of see better what I'm doing. Now my head's going to get in the way for a minute, but it's because I had to make sure I lined up that acetate perfectly. Something that probably would have made this easier, as well as the next part I'm going to do, is if I had just kind of trimmed around the edges of both the foam frames as well as the acetate. I didn't do that, and that's a tip I have for you if you follow this process, is to learn from things I learned as I made this. As you can see, because I didn't cut off anything on the sides or corners or anything, it's a little bit challenging, to say the least, to line up the foam. The good thing about having the acetate covering the entire back, however, and it ended up helping me out, is it was possible for me to still lift the foam off of the frame and help adjust it while I was moving along. I mean, that only works for so long until it pretty much is permanently stuck. So as I'm moving down the card, I think I inadvertently stretched the foam a bit in my pulling on it. So as I get to the bottom, you're going to see it's not going to line up on the bottom edge. And it's not a problem that it doesn't line up on the inside, but it is going to show from the bottom, and I will end up having to use an X-Acto knife and scissors to trim off that bottom edge that wasn't clean in line with the bottom. So I realized at this point I wasn't going to be able to make the foam go back in place, so I thought I would see if I could salvage it. The second time around, I peeled off the bottom half of the foam, and then instead of going down the same way I did before, I pulled adhesive off of the other end and lined that up, and then pressed the middle down. If I had done that with the first one, I think I would have avoided the problem overall with that part sticking out at the bottom. I'm using an X-Acto knife, and it did take me a while to get that trimmed off to where it was fairly clean, so I didn't record it. I've also die cut, as you can see, the stamped background that I did earlier with the same frame die. And now that I have the acetate sandwiched in there between the foam and the brown cardstock die cut piece, I'm just adding some liquid adhesive around this frame, and then I'll place it right on top of that background after I add some anti-static powder to help prevent the sequins from sticking to the acetate or having any static cling. So by adding liquid adhesive, it makes it a little bit easier to line it up with the frame on top. And I'll set a couple of blocks on it and let it sit for a while to dry. And now I'm moving on to working on the coffee cup in sentiment and the little piece of the puff of smoke that's, or I guess steam coming out of the coffee cup. So again, I'm using VersaMark, and I'm using stamping down on a piece of cream cardstock. It's the same as what I used for the background where I stamped the beans onto. And I'm using some Nuvo hot chocolate embossing powder to emboss my stamped image. And this is, it's kind of a fun brown color. It kind of looks a little metallic when it is completely melted. So after I do this, I'm going to end up stamping this sentiment, and I stamped it twice because I didn't like the way the first one came out, and I stamped that piece of steam onto that cardstock with white embossing powder. And as you can see, I die cut a piece of corrugated paper with the coffee cup die, and I cut it so that it would be the correct shape for the little sleeve that goes onto the coffee mug. And I wished I had thought at this point to color in the coffee mug, but I didn't think about it until after I'd already glued this down, so I just grabbed a Copic marker in a light brown color. I think it's E11 is what I'm using here. And normally I would not ever use a Copic marker over embossing powder because I've heard a lot about how it can damage the nib on the marker, so I did my best to avoid coming into contact with that. And I did use a darker marker to accent the edges on it. So for the sentiment, I am going to use this nesting frame to create a similar shape in the top corner, which I've already done actually. I cut that corner so it matches the edge. And I'm going to use the straight side of that die to create this shape that you see, and has the same stitching around all the edges. So that's how I got this to be an unusual shape, yet have all the stitching from that one die. Now I'm gluing that up in the corner, and I don't have much left to go because I only have to add the coffee cup and the piece, or the steam die cut on top or above the coffee cup. And then after this point, the only thing that will be left to do is adhere it to a card base. And I decided to use a piece of craft cardstock to glue this whole thing down to. I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching this video today. I hope that you liked it, and if you did, I hope you will leave me a thumbs up, possibly a comment, and consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. In the meantime, I hope you will be inspired to create something like this yourself, and I dare you to get artsy.